What happened to Jesus during the 18 years missing from the Bible? From age 12 to 30, the record falls eerily silent. Why would history's most studied figure vanish at the peak of his youth? Could Jesus have studied in India, Persia, and Egypt long before preaching in Judea? Why did early church leaders erase his journey from history? Stay with us to the end, where the last chapter reveals the real reason his lost years still shake institutions today. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, controversial history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's proceed with tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Vanishing Boy. In the bustling heart of ancient Jerusalem, the temple echoed with murmurs. Candles flickered against polished stone, casting long shadows over elders cloaked in tradition. They gathered not to pray but to witness something strange. A boy, no older than 12, standing among them and speaking with impossible clarity. He posed questions no one could answer. He unraveled scrolls like a scholar twice his age. The air grew tense. Who was this child? Some were awed, others unsettled. But what happened next was even stranger. Just as quickly as he appeared, the boy vanished from the written record. From this moment until he turned 30, the pages of Scripture fall silent. Not a single account of his teenage years. No stories of his growth, no record of his travels, no sign of where he went or what he learned. The most documented man in history simply disappeared. And that silence was anything but ordinary. Historians have long debated the silence surrounding those years. How could a boy who captivated scholars suddenly dissolve into obscurity? Religious texts are not known for modesty. They celebrate every miracle, every lesson, every step taken by spiritual giants. Yet here, at a pivotal moment in a young prophet's life, the ink runs dry. Was it forgetfulness or intentional omission? Some have argued that the years were unimportant, that Jesus returned at 30 with everything he needed, divinely prepared. But others find that explanation too neat, too convenient. They point to the absence itself as a clue that something happened during those years that certain voices wanted to erase. Because if those years had contained only silence, there would be nothing to hide. And yet, this silence screams. Across time, a question lingered like smoke. Where did he go? As Christianity grew, new generations of scholars, priests, and mystics asked the same thing. Some invented stories, legends passed down in whispers. Others searched archives, looking for lost pages and clues. But for centuries, one truth remained untouched. If Jesus had truly done nothing worth recording between the ages of 12 and 30, why would the Gospels even bother to begin his story with that strange moment in the temple? Why set the stage only to tear down the curtain for nearly 2 decades? The answer might lie not in what was said, but in what wasn't. And as we begin pulling at that thread, what unravels is far more than a childhood mystery. It's a global story buried in dust. In secret corners of monasteries, in footnotes of forbidden texts, in oral traditions passed by ancient cultures, fragments of a larger picture began to emerge. And what they painted wasn't a static boy waiting quietly in Nazareth. It was a traveler, a seeker, a teacher in training, one who wandered far from home, one who walked roads uncharted by Scripture but remembered by those outside the Roman world. As Christianity took shape in the West, these stories were silenced, not by mistake but by fear, because if people believed Jesus had learned from other traditions, then the claim of exclusivity, of being the only way, would crumble. And so, the easiest way to protect a doctrine was to remove the years that challenged it. In the early days of the Church, power was fragile. Rome was watching. Rival sects were rising. Heresies bloomed like wildflowers. To survive, the Church needed unity, and unity required a clear, consistent story. Anything that hinted at uncertainty, foreign influence, or human learning threatened the foundation. The idea that Jesus might have been shaped by other philosophies or trained under other teachers was dangerous. It made him relatable. It made him human. And in a time when divine authority was the key to obedience, human origins were not welcome. So the missing years became a locked room, and the key thrown into the fire. Yet even the tightest grip cannot stop a story from breathing. Across the world, accounts of a mysterious young man began to surface, sometimes in Buddhist temples, other times in Egyptian scrolls. These were not myths born centuries later. Some were written before the Bible was compiled. They spoke of a Western man, radiant and wise, who traveled east, who studied, healed, and taught. He went by different names, sometimes Isa, sometimes the prophet from the West. The details varied, but the essence remained. This was someone extraordinary, someone who matched the lost image of the vanishing boy. Could these stories be more than coincidence? Could they be fragments of a life carefully hidden? The effort to erase those years was not just about control. It was about shaping memory. Memory, after all, is the root of identity. By choosing what to remember and what to forget, the early church sculpted a figure fit for its needs. But truth doesn't die so easily. In the silence, some began to listen differently. Mystics felt echoes of a deeper path. Scholars noticed inconsistencies. Travelers heard whispers in foreign lands. And as these scattered voices grew louder, they began pointing towards something astonishing. Jesus may have spent his so-called missing years not in hiding, but in motion, learning, absorbing, preparing, and what he found may have reshaped his soul forever. If true, this idea changes everything. It suggests that Jesus' teachings were not born in a vacuum, that they were the culmination of a journey across traditions, a fusion of wisdom from the East and the West. It doesn't weaken his message, it deepens it. It makes him a bridge between worlds, not a wall. But that very idea was terrifying to those in power. Because once people realize that truth can be found beyond borders, beyond temples, beyond priests, the control fades. Faith becomes personal, and institutions lose their grip. So instead of sharing the journey, they erased it and called the gaps divine mystery. But the gaps never truly closed. Over the centuries, curious minds kept returning to that blank space. Some wrote books banned by the Vatican. Others followed trails across Asia, seeking the source of the legend. A few even risked their lives to translate forgotten texts locked in Himalayan libraries. These seekers believed the silence wasn't empty, it was censored, and slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. Not everyone agreed, skeptics pushed back. Faithful believers called it heresy. But the evidence, though scattered, began to form a path that leads not into fantasy, but into a very real and very human story of growth. Think about it. If you were to write the biography of someone destined to change the world, would you skip the most transformative years of their life? Would you leave out the heartbreak, the wonder, the mentors, the mistakes, the revelations? Or would you document the journey in vivid detail? The missing years don't feel like an omission. They feel like an intentional veil. And what lies behind that veil may be the most powerful part of all. Because it's there, in the unknown, that Jesus becomes more than a figure on a pedestal. He becomes a seeker like the rest of us. There's a reason this mystery still haunts scholars and believers alike. It's not just about filling in historical blanks. It's about understanding who Jesus really was and what that means for us today. Was he a divine being untouched by human experience? Or was he someone who searched, stumbled, listened, and learned? Someone who traveled far from home, only to return with a message bigger than borders. If that's true, then those missing years are not just a footnote. They're the origin story we were never allowed to see. The chapters that shaped the man behind the message. As this chapter closes, we are left with a haunting silence. But it is not a silence of emptiness. It is a silence of suppression, of stories buried, not lost. In the next chapter, we begin to follow the whispers that escaped that suppression. Whispers that drifted east, carried by time and trade and spirit. In the remote monasteries of India and Tibet, scrolls speak of a man named Isa, a man who came from the West, a man whose story begins to fill the void left by the vanishing boy. If what they say is true, then Jesus never disappeared. He simply walked out of the frame. Chapter 2, Echoes from the East. Far from the hills of Galilee and the temples of Jerusalem, in lands the Gospels never mention, strange tales began to surface. High in the Himalayas and deep in the plains of northern India, whispers echoed through ancient monasteries and shrines. They told of a foreign traveler, a man of light skin and powerful words, who arrived from the West many lifetimes ago. He came not as a conqueror but as a seeker. The monks remembered him. The scrolls recorded him. They called him by another name, a name unknown to Western scripture but sacred in Eastern memory. They called him Isa. He preached love, non-violence, compassion, and unity. He healed with touch. He challenged the powerful. He stayed with them for years, learning and teaching in return. To those who lived in the shadow of the Himalayas, he was not a mystery. He was part of their past. But in the West, his story would be buried. The first hints of Isa's story did not reach the Western world through dusty tomes or church confessionals. They came from an unexpected place, travelers. In the late 1800s, long after colonial explorers had carved roads across Asia, a Russian adventurer named Nicholas Notovich found himself injured near the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, India. The monks offered shelter, and during his recovery, they shared something rare. They brought out ancient scrolls that spoke of a man from the land of Israel who had come to learn their ways. His teachings mirrored those of Jesus. The stories matched too closely to ignore. Notovich was stunned. When he returned to Europe and published what he had found, the reaction was swift and hostile. Scholars dismissed him. Churches denounced the account. But beneath the noise, a deeper question took root. If the monks were wrong, why were they describing someone who fit the missing years so perfectly? Others followed Notovich's path. Researchers and seekers from different parts of the world traveled to the Himalayas, curious to know if his discovery was real or fabricated. What they found startled them. In monastery after monastery, the tale of Isa was told with clarity and reverence. The scrolls, written in Tibetan and Pali, preserved verses describing his travels, his conflicts with local priests, and his miraculous acts. These were not new stories. They had been passed down for generations, held sacred by the same Buddhist communities that believed in reincarnation and enlightenment. Isa had walked among them. He had spoken to their people. Some even claimed he had studied under great masters before returning to his homeland. To them, his story wasn't a revelation. It was history, but for the Western world, it was heresy wrapped in parchment. Why would these stories exist so far from Palestine? That question haunted many who read the accounts. Could it all be coincidence? Or had a young Jesus truly wandered into the East in search of wisdom? The timing fit. The years between 12 and 30, unaccounted for in the Bible, allowed for such a journey. Trade routes were open. Caravans moved freely across Persia and into India. Traveling wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible. More importantly, the teachings of Jesus bore uncanny similarities to Eastern philosophies. His emphasis on inner peace, detachment from material wealth, compassion for all living beings, and the divine spark within, these echoed ideas found in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism centuries earlier. If Isa and Jesus were one and the same, then these influences made perfect sense. But if they were not, the resemblance was uncanny enough to cause discomfort for many religious leaders. The resistance from the West was immediate and intense. Notovich's findings were labeled fraudulent. Scholars who had never visited India dismissed the story outright. The Church took a firm stance. The idea that Jesus could have learned from other religious traditions threatened the core of Christian doctrine. If he had been a student, not just a divine teacher, then the claim of him being born with all knowledge unraveled. It opened the door to a more human Jesus, one who questioned, traveled, studied, and evolved. That version was harder to control. It could empower individuals to look beyond the Church for truth. And so, the easier choice was to deny, suppress, and forget. But the scrolls refused to disappear. In dusty corners of Tibetan libraries, in the chants of Ladakhi monks, in oral traditions passed from one generation to the next, Isa's name endured. Some monks believed he was a bodhisattva, a soul who chose to return to help others. Others believed he was an incarnation of divine truth. Their respect for him was deep and unwavering. They did not see him as a foreigner, but as a brother. Even today, pilgrims who visit these monasteries report tales of the great teacher from the West. His story is woven into the fabric of Eastern spiritual history. It was only in the West that the thread was cut short. The strange part is this: had these accounts not challenged the official story, they might have been embraced. But their content was too aligned, too dangerous, too illuminating. The miracles described in the Tibetan scrolls mirrored those in the Bible: healing the sick, calming tempers, facing opposition from religious authorities. But they occurred in India, they occurred in Nepal, and that made all the difference. Because if Jesus had performed miracles outside of Judea, it meant his mission was bigger than the Church ever admitted. It meant he saw no borders, and that revelation threatened the very walls that Christianity had built to define itself. Other explorers began to find supporting evidence. Ancient Persian texts hinted at a prophet who passed through their lands, teaching love over law. Some Brahmin traditions mentioned a radiant foreigner who challenged the caste system, speaking of universal brotherhood. In Sri Lanka, local legends spoke of a peaceful teacher from the west who stayed among the island's monks for a season, offering wisdom and learning their ways. None of these accounts named him Jesus, but all spoke of a man who sounded like him. A man whose path connected all of these stories together like hidden beads on a necklace no one was meant to wear. For those willing to listen, a pattern emerged. The missing years were not truly missing. They were hidden in plain sight, preserved by those who had no interest in church politics or Western power. These Eastern traditions never sought to claim Jesus as their own. They did not declare him divine or demand worship. They simply honored him as a great teacher who came to learn and teach. That humility made their records more believable, because they had nothing to gain. In many cases, they didn't even know the controversy they were part of. They simply told the truth as they had always known it. But the more evidence mounted, the more aggressively it was denied. The institutions built around one version of the story had too much to lose. Admitting the possibility of Jesus in India or Tibet would require rewriting centuries of theology, dogma, and religious authority. And so a quiet war began. A war not of swords or fire, but of erasure. Books were discredited, researchers were ridiculed, pilgrims were told they had been misled. The scrolls themselves, when mentioned at all, were labeled myths. And yet they remained, locked away, waiting for new eyes and open hearts. It's important to understand that this chapter is not about proving with certainty that Jesus was Isa. It's about recognizing that the East remembers something the West chose to forget. The consistency across regions, the echoes in doctrine, the geographical timelines, all of it points to a possibility too compelling to ignore. Whether one sees it as truth or parable, the story of Isa adds color to the blank pages of Jesus' life. It doesn't replace the known history, it completes it. And it forces us to ask a difficult question. What else was buried? As we move forward, the story deepens. If Jesus did travel east, how did he get there? What roads did he walk? Who were his guides? What temples welcomed him? In the next chapter, we follow the trail step by step. Through desert sands, mountain passes, and sacred shrines, we piece together a journey that no gospel dares to tell. We follow the young seeker as he transforms, alone, far from home, learning the truths that would one day challenge an empire. The trail is long, the silence deafening, but the footprints are still there for those who dare to see them. Chapter 3: Lost in the Himalayas. To imagine the journey Jesus might have taken is to retrace a path shrouded in dust and silence. From the green hills of Galilee to the jagged ridges of the Himalayas, the road stretches across deserts, kingdoms, and belief systems. It would not have been easy. It would not have been safe. But it was possible. In the first century, the Silk Road pulsed with life. Caravans moved spices, textiles, philosophies, and people. From Persia to India, travelers carried more than goods, they carried stories. If Jesus set out in his youth, determined to seek wisdom beyond Judea, this was the artery he would have followed. His path may have wound through Babylonian cities still glowing with ancient magic, through Zoroastrian fire temples flickering with sacred flame, and into the fertile valleys of the Indus River. Each stop a lesson, each mile a transformation, and each border he crossed brought him closer to a truth long hidden from the Western world. He would have traveled as a stranger. No one in Persia or India would have known his name, but perhaps they recognized something in his eyes, a hunger for understanding, a calm beyond his years. Among the Zoroastrians, he may have learned the concept of duality. Light and dark, good and evil, a universe constantly in battle, requiring choice and intention. This would plant seeds he would later nurture into parables of inner struggle. Further east, he may have encountered Jain monks, clad in simple robes, walking barefoot across burning sands to avoid harming even the smallest insect. Their reverence for life may have left an imprint. But it was in India, scholars believe, where the most profound transformation could have occurred. Here, among riverside ashrams and forested retreats, Jesus may have met the sages who spoke of oneness, of self as illusion, of detachment from worldly things and union with the divine, ideas radically different from the laws he had known in Judea. In northern India, near present-day Varanasi, a young seeker could blend into the sea of students who gathered at the feet of gurus. No status, no robes, just silence, questions, and the patience to listen. In the sacred city of Benares, spiritual teachings were not locked in temples. They lived in the streets. Philosophers debated under banyan trees. Yogis meditated beside riverbanks. Knowledge passed from breath to breath. If Jesus entered this current, he would have immersed himself in Sanskrit chants, meditative disciplines, and the Vedas, texts older than Moses, deeper than the laws of Rome. He may have practiced breath control, learned to sit in stillness for hours, and understood how the mind shapes reality. These were not abstract lessons. They were paths walked by living men, and if Jesus walked among them, he too would have become something more than what he was. Further north, the Himalayas rose like jagged questions against the sky. If he followed the path of Isa, he would have arrived in Ladakh, a region nestled between India and Tibet. Cold, remote, and rich in spiritual tradition, Ladakh was home to Buddhist monasteries untouched by empire. Here, the scrolls of Isa were said to be preserved. If Jesus reached these mountains, he may have lived among monks who taught compassion without reward, wisdom without authority. He would have studied the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the idea of nirvana not as dogma but as experience. The quiet discipline of these monks, their detachment from possessions, and their absolute focus on ending suffering may have reshaped his understanding of divinity. No golden temples, no bloody sacrifices, just silence, presence, and love. In their eyes, he was not a god. He was a traveler on the same road as them, a student, a soul in search of awakening. The connection between Buddhist and Christian teachings has long puzzled scholars. Turn the pages of both and echoes appear. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, detach from the material, see the divine in all beings. The parallels are not accidental. If Jesus spent time in the Himalayas, these teachings would have become part of him, not borrowed but absorbed, not memorized but lived. They would resurface later in Galilee, when he taught the masses not with threats but with compassion. His ideas, once foreign to the priesthood of Jerusalem, would suddenly mirror the wisdom of India's sages. And that, perhaps, is why his message felt so radical, because it was rooted in truths older than Judea. Truths carried across mountain passes, kept alive in temples the West never saw. The physical journey would have changed him. The landscape alone, the towering peaks, the thin air, the silence of snow-covered paths, forces the soul to confront itself. Isolation sharpens clarity, hunger tests endurance. And with each step into the mountains, the boy from Nazareth would shed something of his past. His ego, his fear, his assumptions. The Himalayas are not merely geography, they are transformation. Countless seekers have walked into those heights and returned transformed. If Jesus was among them, he would not have come back the same. He would have returned with a presence not learned in books, but earned in silence. And the man who emerged at 30 would carry the imprint of those sacred heights forever. But how would he have survived? The journey was perilous. Bandits roamed the trade routes. Languages shifted from village to village. Even food and climate could have been fatal, unless, of course, he was guided. Some believe Jesus may have traveled with caravans, merchants who saw the spark in him and offered safe passage. Others believe he was protected by local teachers who saw his potential. In ancient India, a promising student could be fed, clothed, and trained simply for showing devotion. No payment, no transaction, just the preservation of wisdom. If Jesus found such a teacher or several, they may have sheltered him from the worst dangers. They may have taught him how to survive not just the journey, but the truth it carried. At some point, his path would have turned homeward. Whether after years or a single transformative season, the seeker would become the messenger. His heart, once full of questions, would now carry answers. Not absolute truths, but perspectives, ways of seeing the world. He would return with the seeds of a new doctrine, one that honored love above law, presence above ritual, unity above hierarchy. And yet, he would return to a land not ready for such ideas. His homeland was ruled by Rome and bound by tradition. His teachings would clash with both. And in the conflict that followed, the memory of his eastern journey would be erased. Not just forgotten, but forbidden. The stories of Isa survive in places untouched by empire. In the monasteries of Hemis. In the teachings of obscure Buddhist orders. In footnotes of Persian histories, they describe a man who was gentle yet firm, humble yet profound. They never claim him as theirs. They offer no demand for recognition. They simply remember. That memory, floating in the thin air of the Himalayas, may be the last honest witness to the missing years. It may explain the leap from temple prodigy to spiritual revolutionary. It may reveal why Jesus spoke as he did, healed as he did, lived as he did, because he had seen another way, and he brought it home. Skeptics dismiss the entire theory as fantasy. They say no proof exists, no map, no diary. But proof, in this case, was never meant to survive. Oral traditions were not written for approval. They were passed on because they mattered. The monks had no reason to lie. The parallels in teaching have no reason to be ignored. The journey, while difficult, was possible. And the transformation it implies answers the greatest question the Bible never dares to ask. Where did Jesus learn the truths that shook the world? If not from men, then from where? And if from men, then who were they? As we leave the mountains, a new mystery unfolds. India and the Himalayas offer a glimpse of the road taken, but another ancient center of wisdom beckons from the opposite direction. Egypt, home to temples older than memory, guardians of sacred geometry and hidden knowledge. Some believe Jesus did not walk one path, but many, that he also studied the secrets buried beneath the sands. In the next chapter, we follow a different trail, one whispered among Gnostics and guarded by stone. In Egypt's forbidden schools, a new side of the vanished boy begins to emerge, and with it, another piece of the puzzle is revealed. Chapter 4: Egypt's Forbidden Schools. As the desert sun rose over the Nile, shadows stretched across the ruins of Hermopolis. The city was once a cradle of knowledge, sacred to the god Thoth, keeper of wisdom, writing, and divine secrets. Long before Greek philosophers wrote their first verses, the priests of Egypt guarded truths older than pyramids. Hidden beneath temples and etched into walls were lessons not meant for the masses. They spoke of spirit traveling beyond flesh, of light buried within man, of resurrection not just of body but of consciousness. In these sacred spaces, foreign initiates were rare, but some, drawn by fate or curiosity, found their way in. Among the names whispered through Egyptian lore is a radiant stranger, young, intense, and unlike the others. He asked strange questions. He sought more than ceremony, and some say he came from the land of Israel. Could Jesus, before his public ministry, have studied here, in the heart of Egypt's forbidden schools? To understand this possibility, we must first enter the realm of the mystery schools. These weren't places of public worship. They were inner sanctums, where spiritual mastery required sacrifice, silence, and transformation. Only the few who passed trials, both mental and mystical, could proceed. These weren't just teachings. They were experiences. Initiates were lowered into darkness, made to confront their fears, and shown glimpses of divine structure. The ancient Egyptian belief system held that all life mirrored a cosmic order, Ma'at. To live in harmony with this truth was to awaken the God within. The final goal was to become a fully realized being, not just in death, but in life. This philosophy would later echo through Gnostic teachings, through Sufi wisdom, and some believe through the words of Jesus himself. If he studied here, his understanding of life, death, and the divine may have come not from scripture, but from initiation. There are tantalizing hints scattered through time. In early Gnostic texts, those excluded from the official Bible, a version of Jesus emerges that feels eerily Egyptian. He speaks in symbols. He teaches that the kingdom is within. He speaks of light trapped in matter, of divine sparks waiting to be freed. These ideas aren't typical of ancient Jewish thought, but they match the teachings of Egyptian mystics and Platonic philosophers shaped by Egyptian rites. Some of these Gnostic texts describe a hidden wisdom that Jesus shared only with a select few. Wisdom deemed too dangerous or misunderstood for the public. That echoes the very structure of Egypt's mystery schools. Outer rituals for the public, inner truth for the initiated. What if Jesus had learned that pattern first in Egypt, long before his ministry ever began? Historically, the journey to Egypt would have made sense. It was a known destination for spiritual seekers. Even Moses, according to scripture, was raised in Egyptian courts. Alexandria, home to the legendary library, was a melting pot of Greek, Hebrew, Egyptian, and Persian thought. And Hermopolis, though more remote, was a center of magical and sacred instruction. If Jesus had walked into these cities, he would not have been out of place. Young, curious minds from across the ancient world came there to ask the biggest questions. Who are we? Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? The answers Egypt offered were complex, symbolic, and hidden in ritual. But for a seeker who had walked the Himalayas and meditated with monks, Egypt's depth may have felt familiar. Another step on a growing inner path. Some clues lie in the architecture of his teachings. Take his parables, stories with hidden meanings. The mystery schools used similar methods. Lessons were wrapped in symbols, so only those ready to receive them could understand. Or consider his emphasis on death and rebirth, not just as physical events, but as spiritual transformations. Egyptian initiates underwent symbolic death, entered the underworld, and returned with enlightenment. The parallels are haunting. They suggest more than coincidence. They suggest lineage. Even his strange silences, moments when he answered questions with questions, feel more like the riddles of Thoth than the direct pronouncements of Hebrew prophets. Was he hiding something, or honoring a tradition of secrecy? The Gospel of Thomas, a banned text rediscovered in the 20th century, offers a different voice of Jesus. Here, he sounds more like a mystic than a Messiah. He speaks not of salvation through faith, but of awakening through knowledge. He says the light is within you. He says split the wood and I am there. These are echoes of Hermeticism, an Egyptian-rooted tradition that saw all reality as divine. In Hermetic thought, the seeker must descend into the self to find the all. The divine wasn't a throne above. It was a truth buried within. This was dangerous knowledge, empowering, decentralized, and it sounds exactly like the Jesus that church fathers tried to suppress. The early Roman Church had no tolerance for such ideas. A Jesus who had learned from pagans? A Jesus who taught that salvation came not through obedience but through inner awakening? That was chaos. It undermined hierarchy. It turned every individual into a temple. And so these teachings were buried. Scrolls were burned, gospels were excluded. The Egyptian influence was erased, but the desert remembers. In Nag Hammadi, a farmer in 1945 unearthed a clay jar filled with ancient scrolls. Among them were writings from early Christians who clearly believed something very different from what we're told today. Their Jesus was deeply Egyptian, deeply symbolic, and deeply dangerous to empire. It's no accident that Egypt became a central battleground for religious memory. The early Christian desert fathers who fled Rome's growing power sought refuge in Egypt's caves. There, they practiced silence, meditation, and inner purification, more Eastern than Roman. They preserved the practices Jesus may have learned. But as the Roman Church expanded, it reclaimed even the desert, sanitizing its saints, absorbing its wisdom, and erasing its roots. Egypt, once the fountain of spiritual fire, was reduced to biblical backdrops. Its deeper role, its possible role in shaping Jesus, was buried beneath centuries of denial. But some stories slipped through. Arab historians from later centuries recorded strange tales of a foreign teacher passing through the Nile cities. Some linked him to the Essenes, a Jewish sect known for their asceticism and secrecy, one that had connections to Egyptian mysticism. Others spoke of scrolls hidden beneath the sands, protected by desert tribes who believed the truth had once walked among them. These weren't official histories, but they weren't random either. They hinted at a thread the official narrative refused to pull. And when read alongside the suppressed Gnostic texts, a picture forms, not of a man outside Egypt, but of one shaped by its ancient fire. If Jesus walked in Egypt, he would have entered the final phase of his preparation. He would have seen how truth could be protected through allegory, how symbols could speak louder than laws. He would have learned the weight of silence, the power of ritual, and the danger of knowledge in the wrong hands. Egypt taught not just what to say, but when to say it, not just what to reveal, but what to veil. These lessons would follow him into Galilee, where every word he spoke carried a double edge, simple on the surface, infinite beneath. To most, he preached in parables, but to those with eyes to see, he revealed a hidden kingdom. As this chapter ends, we are left not with proof, but with resonance. The Jesus who returned to Judea was not just a prophet. He was a composite, a bridge between East and West, between mysticism and tradition, between silence and revolution. Egypt, with its cryptic halls and vanished texts, may have been the final stone in his foundation. In the next chapter, we look deeper into the figures who may have shaped him. Hidden teachers scattered across continents. They were not apostles. They were shadows. And if they existed, their erasure was no accident. Behind every awakened soul stands a silent master, and Jesus may have had more than one. Chapter 5: The Secret Teachers. Behind every great journey lies a trail of shadows, figures who appear, whisper wisdom, then vanish before the world knows their names. If Jesus spent his lost years traversing lands as ancient as India, Persia, and Egypt, then he did not walk alone. Teachers would have found him, not in formal classrooms, but in caves, temples, markets, and moments of silence. These weren't public prophets or priests. They were mystics, hermits, and sages, keepers of knowledge too fragile for empire. Each may have left a fingerprint on his soul, not through force, but by simply embodying a truth so profound it needed no words. These secret teachers are never named in Scripture, but their lessons echo in every strange turn his message took. Their teachings, scattered across cultures and faiths, seeped into the parables, metaphors, and paradoxes he would later deliver. To follow their trail is to glimpse the invisible hands that shaped a revolutionary who preached love in a world ruled by swords. Among the earliest possible influences were the Zoroastrians of Persia. Their view of the universe as a battlefield between light and darkness was not merely myth, it was lived doctrine. Fire temples burned continuously, symbolizing the light of divine order. If Jesus stood before those flames, he may have absorbed their deeper meaning. Not just fire as light, but fire as transformation. The idea that each human held a spark of the divine, battling illusion and chaos, would later resurface in his teachings on the inner kingdom. But the Zoroastrians did more than shape theology. They honored truth-tellers, those who walked in righteousness not for reward, but because they must. A young traveler, sincere in his search, would have drawn their attention. And perhaps, somewhere in the desert silence, a priest shared more than rituals. Perhaps he showed Jesus the power of duality not as division, but as choice. A choice that every soul must face alone. In India, the tradition of teacher and student was sacred. The guru was not just a spiritual instructor, but a living embodiment of truth. In ashrams and forest retreats, wisdom was transmitted not through debate, but through presence. If Jesus lived among them, he would have witnessed a different kind of authority. One that didn't demand obedience, but invited surrender to the divine within. There, a teacher might remain silent for days, speaking only when the disciple was ready. Lessons came through stillness, observation, and paradox. Truth was not imposed, it was uncovered. The concept of ego dissolution, the illusion of self, and the cycle of rebirth would have been foreign to a Jewish boy. But in the patient rhythm of yogic life, those ideas could become more than philosophy. They could become experience. And one master, or many, could have led him toward that transformation. The teachings he later shared in Galilee may have started as whispers from these Himalayan sages. Buddhist monks, too, lived along the trail he may have taken. In Ladakh and Kashmir, monasteries dotted the landscape like quiet sentinels. These monks practiced compassion as discipline. They trained the mind to release suffering, not by changing the world, but by changing perception. If Jesus spent time with them, he would have encountered meditation, mindfulness, and the Four Noble Truths. Their worldview held no permanent self, only endless becoming. Their ethics rested on compassion for all living things. A stray traveler with intense eyes and kind words would not have been turned away. He may have slept on their floors, eaten their simple meals, and sat among their chants. In this silence, a seed may have taken root, one that bloomed years later when he taught forgiveness, mercy, and the sanctity of life, not as commands, but as pathways to liberation. Perhaps a monk, long forgotten, handed him a scroll or told a story that changed everything. From the east, we turn to the deserts of Judea, where another group stood apart, the Essenes. This Jewish sect lived in isolation near the Dead Sea, practicing strict rituals, studying ancient texts, and awaiting a messianic age. Their writings, discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, speak of inner purification, hidden knowledge, and a teacher of righteousness. They believed in spiritual resurrection, communal living, and divine light buried within the body. If Jesus encountered them in his youth or upon returning from abroad, their teachings would have resonated deeply. Here was a version of Judaism that sought direct communion with God, not through the temple elite, but through ascetic living and spiritual insight. The Essenes rejected corruption. They studied prophecy. They lived apart from the world, but not apart from truth. A young mystic returning with Eastern wisdom might have found in them a bridge, familiar yet open. And perhaps, among their scrolls, he saw reflections of what he had just lived. There are legends of a teacher known only as Melchizedek, tied to both Jewish mysticism and ancient priesthoods. In some early Christian texts, he appears as a timeless figure, one who teaches without lineage, who blesses without temple. Could such a teacher have met Jesus in his wanderings? Could this name be a placeholder for a series of hidden guides, each one appearing in the moment most needed? The archetype of the hidden master is not new. In Sufi Islam, they're called the Abdul. In Hinduism, the Siddhas. In Buddhism, the Bodhisattvas. These beings appear to guide, then disappear, asking nothing in return. They are not bound by titles. They don't build followings. Their only role is to pass on the spark. If Jesus met such figures, if he learned from this invisible network of wisdom, then his missing years become something more than a mystery. They become a rite of passage through a global lineage of awakened souls. Even the Taoist sages of China, though less directly connected, leave fingerprints in his message. The Tao, or Way, teaches balance, harmony, and the surrender of will. It emphasizes the power of emptiness, the wisdom of stillness, and the futility of force. While there's no evidence Jesus traveled that far east, he may have encountered merchants or wandering monks who carried those ideas westward. The parables he told, "The last shall be first, the meek shall inherit," resonate with the same paradoxical clarity. He taught not domination but flow, not resistance but acceptance. These were not the strategies of empire. They were the marks of one who had seen beyond it. And somewhere in the deserts, mountains, and hidden valleys, some teacher, gave him that lens. Why were these teachers never named? Why do the Gospels leap from boy to man without telling us who shaped him? Perhaps because naming them would have unraveled the story the early church wanted to protect. A Messiah who learned? A Savior who sat at the feet of pagans? That would append the claim of divine exclusivity. It would suggest that truth is not owned, but shared, that no faith holds monopoly over the sacred, and that idea, dangerous, liberating, universal, had to be buried. To keep the myth clean, the teachers had to vanish, their names forgotten, their teachings either absorbed silently or condemned loudly. But the imprint remains, in the gaps, in the edges, in the places where Jesus sounds less like a rabbi and more like a wandering sage. This was not a conspiracy of men alone. It was a war between ideas, between control and freedom, between dogma and discovery. The hidden teachers didn't seek power. They offered tools. And those tools, if passed to Jesus, became the foundation of a message that threatened kingdoms. He didn't just return with foreign concepts. He returned with something worse, a path that made intermediaries obsolete, that made temples unnecessary, that made every soul sacred. It was not just Rome he challenged. It was every gatekeeper of truth. And so the names were lost, but not the wisdom. It lives in every cryptic phrase, every paradoxical lesson, every quiet moment in the Gospels that resists literal meaning. These are the echoes of the secret teachers. They didn't seek recognition. They didn't leave signatures, but they left him changed. The Jesus who returned was not the boy who left. He was a synthesis, a mirror of truths scattered across continents. And the trail he followed, though erased, can still be faintly seen by those who choose to look. In the next chapter, we step into the aftermath. Jesus returns with a message too vast to be contained. He speaks with new authority, new fire, and new danger. But the world he enters is not eager to listen. It is ready to silence. And what followed wasn't just crucifixion. It was erasure. The missing years weren't lost by accident. They were buried, and the early church helped dig the grave. Chapter 6. Rome's Great Silencing. When Jesus returned, he was not the same boy who had vanished. He came back with a quiet fire in his eyes, his words laced with deeper riddles, his message sharpened by years of study across foreign lands. But the world he returned to was neither ready nor willing to understand what he had become. Judea was a province suffocating under Roman rule, and the temple elite clung to tradition like armor. Into this fragile tension, Jesus brought a dangerous new idea, that the divine lived within, that salvation was personal, and that the path to God could bypass all institutions. This was not rebellion through violence. It was rebellion through awakening, and that made it even more dangerous. Empires fear ideas more than swords, and what followed was not just his death. It was a deliberate effort to reshape, erase, and control the story. His missing years, full of complexity, were the first to disappear. As the Jesus movement grew, it began to fracture. Different groups remembered him differently. Some saw him as a mystical teacher, others as a political liberator, and others still as a divine being beyond human comprehension. Dozens of texts circulated, some from those who had walked with him, others from those inspired by his deeper message. But this diversity threatened unity. Rome had no patience for complexity, and the early church, in its bid for legitimacy and survival, began the great narrowing. The Council of Nicaea, centuries later, would be remembered as the birthplace of orthodoxy. But long before that moment, texts were being quietly removed, teachings were being denounced, and alternate versions of Jesus were being silenced. His missing years didn't fit the tidy framework of divinity born to die, so they were trimmed away, and what was left became the official story. One of the earliest casualties of this purge was the Gospel of Thomas. Found buried in Egypt centuries later, it painted a portrait of Jesus that was inward, symbolic, and deeply connected to personal enlightenment. It suggested that understanding one's own nature was the path to divine connection. But such teachings couldn't survive in a church that sought hierarchy and obedience. So it was banned, declared heresy, left to rot in the desert sands. The same fate met other writings, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of Enoch. These texts spoke of visions, hidden wisdom, and the sacred feminine. They offered a Jesus who was not merely a sacrifice, but a teacher of divine reality. If his years of travel and learning were known to those authors, it made sense why those stories vanished. His missing years didn't just disappear, they were buried under the weight of empire and fear. Why were these teachings so threatening? Because they took power away from the institution. If the divine was within, if truth could be found through inner awakening, then there was no need for mediators, bishops, or holy empires. Rome had learned through its conquests that controlling the story meant controlling the people. And the church, aligned with the empire, needed one version of Jesus, born of a virgin, crucified, resurrected, and returning. A neat arc, a divine plan. But that version left no room for a young man who had walked among monks in Tibet or studied under sages in Egypt. It left no room for the possibility that Jesus had grown into his divinity, shaped by teachers and time. And so those years were reduced to silence, a blank space where there had once been fire. The process wasn't sudden. It happened in stages, councils convened, scrolls reviewed, decisions made. What was truth, what was falsehood? Men in robes decided. Politics shaped theology. The Gospels were edited, some subtly, others drastically. Anything that hinted at secret knowledge, personal awakening, or foreign influence was either reinterpreted or erased. And the further Jesus's teachings drifted from their mystical roots, the more Roman they became. Church buildings rose like temples. Rituals replaced meditation. Obedience replaced inquiry. And the living, breathing man behind it all became a distant icon, frozen in time, stripped of nuance and humanity. The silencing of his missing years was not a footnote in history. It was the cornerstone of a new religion. Even more chilling was the targeting of those who remembered differently. The Gnostics, those early Christians who emphasized inner revelation, were hunted, their communities destroyed. Their scrolls were burned or hidden, their leaders branded as heretics. The Cathars in medieval France, descendants of Gnostic thought, were exterminated in one of the bloodiest crusades in church history. Their crime, believing that God could be known directly, that Jesus was a guide rather than a gatekeeper. The fear was never of false teachings, it was of uncontrollable truth, one that could not be confined to doctrine or creed, one that might lead followers to question the need for priests, popes, or empires at all. All across Europe and the Middle East, temples were built atop older sacred sites. Texts were rewritten to align with Rome's version of salvation. And slowly a collective amnesia set in. The Jesus who may have walked with Zoroastrians, meditated with yogis, and learned silence from Egyptian priests became just a storybook messiah. The human journey, the path of discovery, doubt, and awakening was removed. In its place stood divine perfection, untouched, unmoved, eternal. But behind the veil something trembled, a secret barely contained. Whispers of other truths survived in folk tales, monastic libraries, and hidden sections. They spoke of a Jesus whose wisdom had no border, whose message was universal, and whose path had been long and winding. By the time Christianity became Rome's official religion, the transformation was complete. The radical message of inner liberation had been domesticated. The teacher had become a symbol, and the missing years, they were not only irrelevant, they were dangerous. Dangerous because they hinted at human potential. Dangerous because they implied that anyone could follow the same path. If Jesus learned, then so could others. If he awakened, then so might we. But that idea couldn't survive in a world where salvation had been turned into a product, sold, regulated, and controlled. So the story was sealed, and history moved on as if nothing had been lost. But not everyone forgot. Sufi mystics preserved echoes of Eastern wisdom that bore striking resemblance to Jesus's hidden teachings. Kabbalists in Spain and Palestine wrote of divine sparks and hidden paths. Even Renaissance thinkers, drawn to Hermetic texts rediscovered in the East, began to question the official version. They saw connections. They sensed a hidden thread running beneath the dogma. And though they could not speak it openly, they began to suspect that the Church's greatest fear wasn't heresy. It was truth, a truth too expansive for any single book, a truth too powerful for any one institution. Rome's silencing wasn't only about memory, it was about control of the future. By cutting out the missing years, the Church shaped the boundaries of what could be believed. It ensured that Jesus would remain forever distant, too divine to imitate, too perfect to follow, too scripted to question. But in doing so, they also created a crack, a quiet emptiness, and in that silence, curiosity survived. The human need to know the whole story, to fill in what was lost. And across centuries, that silence became a magnet for seekers, historians, and mystics alike. Today, we live in a world where scrolls are unearthed from desert sands, where forgotten languages are decoded, where hidden monasteries still hold clues no one has yet understood. The silencing of Jesus's missing years may have worked for a time, but silence is never permanent. Stories buried will rise, and in the final chapter, we will return to the trail, across continents, through scrolls and ruins, and lay bare the theory that's been waiting for us all along. The missing years were not lost. They were stolen, but now, piece by piece, they return. Chapter 7: The Return of the Hidden Truth. For centuries, the story remained fractured. A boy vanished at 12 and reappeared at 30, transformed, enlightened, and unknowable. The in-between was declared irrelevant, even dangerous. But something strange began to happen. Across continents, across timelines, pieces of the forgotten truth started to reemerge. Ancient scrolls surfaced from dusty caves. Translations from obscure monasteries made their way into curious hands. Explorers unearthed echoes in the East that didn't match the West's official version. What was once buried was beginning to breathe again. And in this final chapter, we thread them together, not as dogma, not as proof, but as a map of possibilities. We do not claim certainty. We seek coherence, a narrative that explains not just where he went, but why it was erased, and why it now matters more than ever. This is not a resurrection of a man, but of memory, a return not to miracles, but to meaning. The missing years have been waiting. Now it is time to remember. Begin in India, where scrolls from Ladakh and Tibet describe a foreigner named Isa. He traveled through their lands, debated their scholars, healed the sick, and preached compassion. His journey echoed with peace. He taught that all life was sacred and that anger and cruelty separated man from the divine. These scrolls, ignored by centuries of theologians, may not name Jesus in the way the West would accept, but the resemblance is uncanny. They paint the portrait of a teacher molded not by tradition, but by pilgrimage. They describe a wisdom gained, not gifted, and that makes all the difference. This version of Jesus wasn't born knowing everything. He sought, questioned, and transformed. His message grew not from a throne in heaven, but from dusty roads and mountaintop temples. And when the church tried to lock divinity in a cage, these scrolls whispered what had been lost. He was one of us, but he chose to become more. Trace the Silk Road westward, and you reach Persia, where the fire temples of Zoroaster kept eternal flames alive. Their philosophy of dualism, their reverence for inner light, and their mythic savior figures echo through early Christian thought like hidden threads. Here, too, we find hints. Tales of a foreign teacher who traveled with caravanners, absorbing wisdom from magi and priests. If Jesus walked those lands, he learned that truth was not one color, but many, that the universe was not a battlefield of good and evil, but a dance of balance. He may have learned that fire purifies not just metal, but souls. This influence could explain why his later teachings focused on choices, on light versus shadow, on inner war rather than external rebellion. His version of the kingdom of God wasn't political. It was personal, and that vision may have first caught fire in Persia's sacred halls. Then comes Egypt, the final crucible, the place where gods died and rose again long before Rome's crucifixion stake was planted. Mystery schools whispered truths about life, death, and transformation. In Hermopolis and Thebes, teachings were encoded in stars, rituals, and hieroglyphs. Gnostic writings found buried in the sand speak of a Jesus who knew these mysteries, who spoke in riddles and parables not because he was evasive, but because he was protecting sacred knowledge meant for seekers, not systems. Perhaps in Egypt, he learned that resurrection was not a one-time miracle, but a process that began within. That the divine spark was not waiting at the end of life, but hidden in every breath. The church rejected this version of Jesus. It was too close, too human, too real. But those teachings survived in fragments, in the Gospel of Thomas, in secret texts, in desert monasteries waiting to be rediscovered by a world finally ready to listen. Layer these truths together, and a new figure takes shape. Not a god in isolation, but a man forged by experience. A spiritual traveler who crossed empires not to conquer, but to learn. Who sat at the feet of sages, drank from many wells, and returned with a synthesis. This Jesus is not easier to follow, he's harder. He challenges us to go on our own journeys, to question inherited truths, to seek not comfort but growth. His missing years are not a flaw in the story, they are the story. They reveal the path we must walk, not a path of blind faith but of awakened effort. And that, perhaps, is what scared the early church the most. A Jesus who learned, who changed, who chose. He is dangerous because he makes us responsible. And in that responsibility lies power, not to rule but to rise. Even the silenced teachers return in this new light. The monks of Ladakh, the gurus of India, the magi of Persia, the Essenes of the desert. They are no longer nameless. They are essential. Their echoes live in every teaching he gave, every paradox he offered, every moment of radical inclusion and compassion. His voice was never his alone. It was a symphony, woven from many cultures, carried across many borders. To deny his teachers is to deny the roots of his wisdom. To erase his travels is to amputate the journey from the destination. But now, as scrolls surface, as scholars dig deeper, and as seekers refuse to settle for simple answers, the truth begins to rise like dawn. And once it rises, it cannot be put back in the dark. This matters now more than ever. In a world fractured by dogma, divided by religion, and numbed by ritual, the real story of Jesus's missing years offers a bridge, not just between East and West, but between belief and experience. He becomes a symbol not of exclusivity, but of universality, a reminder that the divine speaks many languages, that no single religion has a monopoly on truth. If he learned from Buddhists, loved like a Hindu, studied with Zoroastrians, and returned to speak as a Jew, then maybe we too can learn to hold paradox. Maybe faith doesn't mean choosing sides. Maybe it means walking a path with open eyes and an open heart, ready to be changed by what we find. That is the forgotten truth, and it is returning. There's a reason the church feared this. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it was powerful. A Jesus who traveled, transformed, and taught from the depths of lived experience didn't need a pulpit. He needed no crown. He couldn't be bought, controlled, or turned into a political weapon. His power was his humility. His divinity was his humanity. And that kind of savior can't be packaged. So his story was trimmed, simplified, made palatable. The boy genius, the miracle man, the crucified redeemer. But the middle was erased. And in that middle was the fire, the part that could have freed us all. But not anymore. Not in an age where information flows freely, where forbidden scrolls are being translated, and where curiosity is no longer heresy. The missing years are not missing. They were stolen, hidden behind centuries of silence and fear. And now, as seekers connect the dots, as voices long ignored are heard, the full portrait of Jesus begins to return, not as a religious icon, but as a pathfinder, not as a God above, but as a man who rose by walking. And if he walked that road, so can we. The truth is not found in what we've been told. It is found in what we're finally willing to see. His story is not a straight line. It's a spiral, a journey inward and outward, through mountains and deserts, through fear and revelation, through silence and fire. His message was not meant to create walls, it was meant to break them. And it began in those missing years, the years that shaped the greatest mystery of all. How a carpenter's son became a teacher who would shake the world. Now you know the trail. You've walked it across continents, through forbidden texts, through shattered temples and forgotten names. You've seen what was hidden, heard what was silenced. And what remains is not certainty, but calling. The invitation is simple. Seek, learn, walk, and remember. The lost years of Jesus were never truly lost. They were waiting for you